Hello, you're listening to the Adaptive IG Foresight webinar series. Welcome. I'm Gary Colton, founder and chief executive of Adaptive IG. You'll hear shortly a recording of Patrick Ballin presenting Diverse Teams, a Smooth Road to Success or a Car Crash of Conflicting Cultures. We had participants from all over the world on the call, including people from large and small businesses, as well as consultants and coaches. I know you're going to enjoy this session. But first, before I go on to introduce Patrick, I thought it would be helpful to tell you what we do and what you'll gain in this webinar, and just a little bit about Adaptive IG. By the end of today's session, you'll appreciate how diverse teams deliver high performance and how effective interaction plays its part. And you'll also see how culture acts as the glue holding organisations together. Adaptive Intelligence Group, or Adaptive IG for short, is a partnership of experienced business consultants, and we work on organisational culture and performance. And collectively we share a simple belief. It's that the people working in diverse, inclusive cultures are the ones who really deliver the high performance. Patrick's talk was followed by a very interesting Q&A segment that added yet more value. At the end of this session, I'll tell you how you can get in touch with Adaptive IG and also give details of the next webinar in the Adaptive IG Foresight series. So, with no further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our feature presenter, Patrick Ballin. Patrick is a founder member of Adaptive IG, and he has coached and developed teams all over the world for the past 11 years. Prior to entering the coaching and consulting field, he was Global Head of Supply Chain Development at the Body Shop International and a trustee of the Body Shop Foundation. Patrick is a visiting lecturer on Specialist Masters programs at Brighton Business School and holds an MA in Natural Sciences from the University of Cambridge. His topic today is Diverse Teams, a Smooth Road to Success or a Car Crash of Conflicting Cultures. He will draw on his practical experience to examine the benefits and challenges of getting diverse teams to work smoothly together. And he will close with some insights into the relationship between team culture, values and performance. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Gary, and welcome everybody. We know from study after study that diverse teams tend to outperform homogeneous ones. With the right people on the bus, the story goes, we have a smooth road ahead. But we also know that diversity provides challenges within teams. As I find repeatedly working in different organisations across all sorts of sectors and sizes of business, assumptions, backgrounds, and behaviours can be a source of conflict. We're going to examine this dilemma today. We'll start off with a recap on what we already know about diverse teams and performance. We'll then take a look at some of the critical areas to work on that ensure diversity becomes an enabler for team performance rather than a source of unproductive conflict. And we'll go on to consider how to manage diversity, performance, and interaction when different teams come together to work, cross-team collaboration. We'll finish off by considering the situation when organisational cultures combine, for example, in mergers, acquisitions, or long-term partnerships, and introduce the idea of cultural due diligence. Please use the chat facility as we go along to raise questions, and my colleagues and I will respond to these at the end of the presentation. So what do we already know? If you attended his webinar back in June, you'll remember that Dr. Ian Dodds, who's on this webinar today, explained the diversity trumps ability theorem. He explained that for any complex problem, diverse teams consistently outperform homogeneous ones. And my experience is that most of the problems that we have to tackle when we create teams or ask teams to work together are just like the ones referred to here. They're complex. Different points of view need to be aired and explored, and this requires effective interaction, careful listening, and inclusive leadership. As Ian explained also in the last webinar, It's the underlying cognitive diversity that enables performance, our ability to tap into different ways of thinking, which arise from different backgrounds, and the different personalities present. At a team level, a framework that I continue to find helpful here is Dr. Meredith Belbin's team role theory. His research at Henley Management College in the 1980s demonstrated how diverse ways of thinking, acting, and relating within teams contribute to, and in fact are required for, team performance. To give an example, we need to be able to tap into the best ideas people in the team, filter those ideas, and turn them into practical plans for action. While it's unlikely that any one team member is going to be both the best ideas person, the best evaluator of ideas, and the best planner and implementer, it's very likely that in a team of a number of people, at least one person is going to be strong at each of those roles. And team role theory tells us that if we can identify where each person tends to contribute most strongly and make use of this insight, then the team's performance will increase. Just in case you're wondering, by the way, the guy on the top left of this slide isn't me. I know I had a birthday yesterday. It is actually Dr. Belbin himself, who recently turned 90 and is still actively researching in team role theory. How do we achieve performance and make use of underlying diversity to enhance it? To help us understand this, let's look at 7 segments of team performance, which as team leaders or as coaches, we typically have to work on. As we just saw, awareness of individual and team strengths is one of these. Inclusive behaviour is another, and so on. We also have to consider around this the context of how the team works, its values, its purpose, its mission, and its story. What this team stands for, what it exists to do, where it's going, and how and why it came into being. For established and high-performing teams, this context is experienced and internalized by all the team members, and they understand how it relates to the high purpose and the wider mission of the organization within which it sits. I think of it as the shared compass that keeps everyone going in the right direction, and the same direction. But of course, teams don't start out fully equipped and with this compass fully calibrated. We have to get them there. Some of you will recognize Bruce Tuckman's famous stages of team development here: forming, storming, norming, performing, and the 5th stage, which he added later in his research, adjourning. At each stage, team leaders and coaches have to know which of the 7 performance elements we just looked at to give attention to at each of these 5 development stages. Let's look at the forming stage. So at this point, 3 elements are critically important. One of these is to create awareness of the diversity within the team, what individual and what team strengths are present. Unsurprisingly, given what I said already, I will often use the Belbin team roles as an approach to explore this because it's created for the purpose. But the important thing, whatever model you use, is to build understanding and shared language about individual contribution to performance. This is an essential when a new team is forming. Although common language is useful, be careful about typecasting and labeling at this stage: the quiet one, the technical one, the pushy one, and so on. Team members may have a limited or outdated view of each other's abilities and experience, and they need to gain experience of what each other are like. Also, you do want to encourage an understanding of behavioural flexibility as well as a respect for individual strengths. It's unlikely that any of us, one of us is just one team role. At the point of team formation, of course, we don't yet have experience of what sort of team it's going to be. Is this a team that rushes toward action? Does it get bogged down in detail? Does it find collective decision-making easy or hard? So we need to create an understanding of team strengths and watch out for potential gaps and imbalances. Again, a tool like Belbin provides a useful shorthand for discussing these issues of team composition and dynamics and figuring out how to work with these. Newly formed teams also need clarity on their context, their mission, their purpose, and their story. Often we think that when a team comes together, it has an implied purpose, and that's good enough, but it may not be understood the same way by everyone in the team. So in the forming stage, leaders and coaches have to pay attention to clarity of purpose and mission. We have to surface those assumptions about what the purpose is and make sure that we're truly aligned. We need to address the team's story, where it's come from and its values, what it stands for, and to establish ground rules for how the team is going to work. Teams commonly confuse their purpose and their mission with those of the organization as a whole. So we ask them what the distinctive contribution to their purpose and mission will be. What would cease to happen if this team didn't exist? What would not get done? It can take a while to get to a convincing answer. And we're always very cautious of anything that feels too safe or too generic, because the team needs to identify a context that is uniquely its own, its unique purpose. Embedding these contextual elements, values, purpose, mission, and story, provide a touchstone so that as the team progresses the later stages of team development, it can come back, check that it's still on track, and test if the way that these were stated at the outset are still serving the team well. The third element that newly formed teams need to address as a priority is something that Ian Dodds also referred to in our last webinar, which is inclusive behaviour. High-performing teams need what Professor Amy Edmondson of Harvard Business School calls psychological safety. This is a climate where everyone feels able to speak up, offer information and opinions, and not be shot down by the other team members. This sort of behaviour needs to be modelled by leaders, and it can be coached and learned, which is an area where I spend a large part of my own time, as does Ian. In particular, leaders may need to encourage less outspoken, more introverted team members to contribute. They may be shyer to come forward. And they may find it easier to contribute in one-to-one or small group settings. David Rock and colleagues from the Neuro Leadership Institute and Columbia University, writing in the Harvard Business Review last year, corroborated the finding that diversity enhances performance. And they also reinforced the need for psychological safety. Diverse teams, they reported, have a potential for increased conflict, although, in their words, not as much as you think. In fact, David Rock and his colleagues found that the increased challenge and discomfort that comes from different backgrounds and styles is absolutely vital to performance. They contrast this with the risk of bland, over-easy decision-making in more homogeneous teams. And they argue that it's the heterogeneity, the diversity within the team, the differences that need to be discussed that actually contribute most to the performance. So we're back to cognitive diversity again. Creating a climate where different ideas and opinions are aired, challenged, and worked through respectfully is essential for the eventual performance of the team. We've talked about the formation of individual teams. Let's now go on to consider how to manage this when different teams come together. The fundamental principle that diversity enhances performance applies just as much. Two challenges that we have to tackle here to achieve high performance are, one, different group norms. Each of the original teams will have its own way of thinking, acting, and relating, and this might have been quite successful for them. And secondly, silo thinking, tendency to think of us and them, and to stereotype the members of the other part of the team rather than focus on the combined mission, purpose, and story. My colleagues at Three Circle Partners, Max Isaac and Anton McBurney, tell the story of two teams within an international organization. It's a big electronics company that all three of us have worked with for many years. And they call this story Cowboys versus Geeks, hence our picture. The teams had come together for a time-critical product launch that was vital to the business, and it was running well behind schedule. The geeks were dedicated, hardworking, process-driven engineers, and they strove for technical perfection. They're a real bunch of perfectionists, and they loved to get things exactly right and by the book. And the Cowboys were also engineers. They were equally committed, and actually they were equally successful. But they had a different way of working. They were experimental. They liked to try things out, give things a go, tweak things, trial and error. Although both teams had proved very successful on their own, when they came together, they could not come to agreement. The level of trust and effective working between the groups was minimal. Decisions were dragged out or avoided. Milestones were being missed in a very visible way, and an end product was nowhere in sight. And yet, a lot of the things that you'd expect to have in place for this collaboration between teams were in place. These were very capable people. They had all the technical skills that you could ask for. They had commitment from senior management. There was strong sponsorship, and there was a clear sense of urgency. Max and Anton's story is one that you may well be familiar with from other organizations or from some time in your careers. I can think of lots of examples from other places I've worked where teams ended up forming camps: finance versus IT, Brits versus Italians, product group A versus product group B, region A against region B, and so on. There are three common elements in moving this situation forward. These applied in the Geeks and Cowboys situation, and they come up every time. Firstly, the teams, or at least the leaders of the teams, need to come to a realization that interactive effectiveness is at the heart of the solution, that this is an interaction problem, not a resource problem or a strategy problem. Secondly, if they can develop an understanding of how individual team members contribute to the combined team's performance, rather than as members of the Geeks camp or the Cowboys camp, exactly the same step in harnessing diversity that we referred to in the single team situation, then they increase their chances of success. Indeed, the whole point is for everyone to start to act as if this is a single team. And thirdly, with this increased awareness of the resources available to the combined collaboration, they need to regroup around a common purpose, which will be different from the original purpose, the original mission, and the original story of the separate components. So as a combined team, they need to frame why we're here, where we're going, and also how we came into being, why we came to work together. If team leaders lack skill or leadership or experience in inclusive leadership behaviors, they also may require training and coaching around these, because those behaviors are essential to achieving what I just described. So what insight can we draw from this story? Well, I think it's really simple. The contributions that individual team members have to make are more important than our stereotypes about what team part A and team part B might be like. And the diversity of individual contributions, when recognized and used, consistently outweighs and outperforms the differences across teams. We're going to finish off by considering a third level at which either a smooth ride or a car crash can happen around diversity in organizations. This is where two or more organizations come together, for example, through merger, acquisition, or in some form of business-to-business partnership. I spend a large part of my time working with supply chain partners and people in large business process outsourcing contracts. And a lot of the principles we're going to describe here that would apply to organizations coming together and merging are also highly applicable in those situations. Many of the examples that we work with also have an international dimension to them, including the complicating factors of country cultures, something about which our colleague Sharbatuth, present on today's call, has a huge amount of expertise. And I'd encourage you, if you have any questions around international cultures, to ask a question around that, which he can pick up for you. Earlier this year, I encountered a great example of what can happen when two organizations come together and succeed. In this case, I was with a team of Swiss technicians in a big pharmaceutical company, and they were working with a business that they'd recently acquired in California. A bit like the Cowboys versus Geeks story, they were on a time-critical new product development project that was vital to their combined business, in this case, a 2-year project, and at the point I joined them, they were 1 year in. The really striking thing was that because they'd recognized that interaction was a risk to their success from the outset, they'd been working at it from the very first meeting. They'd established ground rules, They defined a shared purpose. And when I met with them, they already felt like a single team that united around a common mission. Over the course of our time working together, they used Ballin as a model to enhance their understanding of everyone's individual team roles and strengths and contributions. And as a team, they identified ways to reduce unproductive conflicts, to approach some critical decisions for the project, and to deliver results together. As a result of that work and the groundwork they'd already laid in the preceding year, the project remains on track, the team has a very good understanding, and when differences do arise, as they inevitably will, they no longer get put down to being a Swiss problem or a California problem, a company A problem and a company B problem, but they become something for the whole team to work on. So that last example was a positive one of working across organizations. And at their best, these external collaborations can feel similar to cross-team working within an organization, like that one did. And sometimes it's possible to build collaboration between organizations in the way I just described, the Swiss example, in what Max Isaac calls a one team at a time approach. I'm now going to talk about a more challenging example of relationships between organizations. And this one involves the Body Shop, whose late founder, the Dame Anita Roddick, is pictured here. Many of you will recognize her. I think we have one or two people actually on today's webinar who work there with me. A passionate advocate for environmental and social causes, Anita and her husband Gordon created an international brand with a very distinctive outlook and culture. And I was fortunate to work there for 14 years. I recently wrote about the Body Shop's unsettled 10-year marriage with L'Oréal, its former owner. The French company bought the business from the Roddicks in 2006, and the Roddicks retired. The L'Oréal culture is very different. Ultra-commercial, competitive, and with a view of beauty as glamour. The Body Shop had campaigned on self-esteem, on animal testing, and on corporate responsibility, and indeed, in past years, L'Oréal and its shareholders, including Nestlé, had often been targets. So we're talking about organizations that really have very different cultures and in particular values. And although there were other economic and strategic factors at play, the fundamental challenge had at its heart the things we've been talking about today, diversity and inclusion. You wouldn't expect either organization to fully take on and embrace all of the values of the other. However, for the collaboration to progress and be productive, they do need to understand and respect each other's values. And instead, my experience over a 10-year period was that there were attempts at times to impose a different culture and a different set of values, at other times to smooth over differences and almost pretend they did not exist, and ultimately largely to leave the Body Shop at arm's length and let it do its own thing. Unsurprisingly, performance wasn't great, and eventually the shareholders persuaded L'Oréal and the Body Shop to divorce. And interestingly, its new owner, Natura, a Brazilian business, seems to share many of its founding values and passions, particularly around sustainability. So there seem to be grounds for optimism in terms of its future. So what can we learn from this? Well, it highlights a conundrum with mergers, acquisitions, and partnerships. We know that a poor cultural fit is one of the biggest risk factors when two organizations come together. But how do we tease out the similarities and differences between organizational cultures and identify that fit? For this sort of cultural due diligence, we believe that a diagnostic approach, like the Denison Organizational Cultural Survey, part of which is shown here, can be really helpful. The Denison survey creates a snapshot of a dozen aspects of organizational culture, benchmarked against a large database of other organizations, and it identifies the areas where there's most work to do. It gives us data, and you can segment that data at an organization, business unit, function, or country level, and start to work out where the risks and the opportunities lie. Often, as you can imagine, we find that the work that results means working with key teams and cross-team collaborations, one team at a time. The core value questions on the Denison survey, the ones on the screen now, are instructive. In fact, Karen Jones, the European MD of Denison, describes these as the glue that holds a global organization together. And she identifies the single question, the fourth on the list here: ignoring core values will get you in trouble. as the single most sensitive question on their whole cultural survey. If the answer to this question is consistently no, then she argues that the espoused values of the organisation are unlikely to be honoured, and you're unlikely to create focus, consistency and stability, which are all essential for the seeds of organisational diversity to take root and to flourish. You can imagine how this might have played out with the Body Shop and L'Oreal. Cultural due diligence can identify the gaps and potential synergies before organisations combine. You can imagine something like this being very useful for Natura as the new owner of the Body Shop, or to pick a different example, to be of value to an organisation entering into a supply chain partnership or major outsourcing contract. It gives us data that allows us to leverage this difference as a source of strength with a smooth road to success, rather than create risk, a cultural car crash. I'd like to finish with one of my favourite quotations about collaboration and performance. Benjamin Franklin was a politician and a polymath, and his wise words convey some very simple and important truths: that we survive or we fall by our ability to work with the diverse people around us and to unite around a common purpose and values. I believe that the lessons and the tools are there to enable this to become a smooth road or for it to be a car crash. And I'm going to suggest that the rest is up to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That's an excellent presentation, very enlightening. So we have the opportunity for the listeners to ask questions. To do this, if you click on the chat function at the bottom of your screen, just type in the question. But meanwhile, I've got one or two questions that have come in ahead of the webinar, and I'd like to ask you these to start off with, Patrick. If you were advising an organization which was forming a new team from two existing teams or members of two existing teams, how would you advise them to make a start in terms of interactive effectiveness?
So I think the very first thing that I would want to do, having met with the leadership of the teams, is to encourage them to get the team together over a period of probably 2 or 3 sessions, spaced over 6 to 8 weeks. Because team formation isn't something that happens overnight. It's not a kind of team building session approach we know doesn't work very well. So to have a number of sessions where they start to address the things we talked about. So first of all, to focus on what do we like? So what sort of people have we got in this team and how do they tend to contribute? And take the focus away from, well, this person's from that team and this person's from the other team, and instead into, what does Gary do? What does Ian do? What does Jim do? What does Lee do? How do they contribute? Not from a technical sense, but in a behavioural sense. And secondly, from there, to start getting the team to focus on, what are we here to do? Why have we combined and formed? What's our mission? What do we stand for? And to start to unite around those. Because once you have a standard, a flag to rally around, and an understanding of the capabilities within the team, then you have some of the raw materials for success. And I'll just add one third thing, and it's something that Ian Dodd spoke about in his last seminar, which is the leaders also have to be able to quick to draw out those behaviors from the team members. So they need to be trained in or coached in interactive effectiveness if they don't already have those capabilities.
Okay, thank you. I've got one more question. How important is it for the two organizations to develop a shared vision of future success?
Absolutely critical. And if you think about what I just said about context, and I think we're talking here about the organization level.
Yes.
Where collaborations between organizations tend to fail is not at the strategy or commercial terms levels. Because actually that's usually where, in the course of forming contracts and agreements, whether it's to buy company A, buy company B, or company A work with company B, that's where we tend to put a lot of effort. but to focus on what's the shared context, what's the culture, how are we going to work together? Because we know that the risk consistently, collaboration after collaboration, whether we're talking about supply chain, whether we're talking about outsourced contracts, whether we're talking about mergers and acquisitions, the risk consistently is if they don't fit well and work well, then whatever was theoretically on the table in terms of performance fails. One of the things that's really interesting is I will sometimes get people from the two different organizations to get into subgroups, have a discussion for 20 minutes or half an hour about what do they think their vision is? Why do they think they're there? And then to play it back. And it's fascinating how when you'd assume that everybody was on the same page, when they do that, they have some radically different ideas. And of course, that's great because as soon as you surface that, you can start to work through it and go, so if it's not that or it's not that one, then what exactly is it? And it's unlikely to just be some sort of mishmash in the middle. It's likely to be something that's somewhat different from both.
Okay. And another question that's been submitted by a text message is, when you're working with a team that is newly formed from maybe not just two other teams, but three other or four other teams, what are the early warning signs that the interaction is not as effective as it might be? What can you often observe?
Well, it tends to go one of two ways, either of which will result in the team's performance not being where you want it to be. So the early warning, the first early warning sign usually is that the outputs are not coming together in the way that you'd hoped. One is what I call the politeness trap, which is where the teams come together and they're so nervous about dealing with any differences that exist between them that they don't discuss what they disagree on. And the result is, and there's actually an organization I've been working with in the last week that's just like this. The result is that people get their heads down and they get on the best they can in the different camps, but they don't actually surface what's different, and it tends to come to a head later. And what you want to do is to get them as early as possible, raising where there are points of difference, discussing those points of difference, looking at the data around those. The other, of course, which we tend to think of as more common, but actually in my experience in diverse teams is less common, is that comes out as overt conflict very early on. They actually come together and they can't agree, and there's visible disagreement, and it's unproductive disagreement. And there we need to lower the temperature, but we need to lower the temperature. We don't need to create an avoidance of conflict situation.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. Members of Adaptive IG, do any of you have anything to add to Patrick's answers in these areas? Shaba, I know that you work a lot in intercultural analysis. Is there something you'd like us to hear from you?
Yes, that's true. I think sometimes the biggest challenge is to understand how people can measure and leverage personal and cultural differences. Because companies seem to talk about diversity and inclusion a lot, but not many of them understand the difference between the two concepts. I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Some companies try to tick the boxes and they introduce a few programs, and some companies really invest in their people, and that's when you can make a real big difference. The other big challenge is that most of the solutions were created before globalization, and now we are facing new challenges. But still, we are offering the old solutions, and that creates a friction. And sometimes that makes it difficult to justify the return on investment. That's how I see it.
Okay, thank you, Shaba. And Lee, you're our expert in health and wellness. What kinds of consequences do you observe in teams that are underperforming or might be having conflict issues? You there, Lee? Seems to have an issue with her internet connection. Okay, so I'll leave that question hanging in the air for a future webinar. So That's it for the questions. I'd just like to round up. So thank you for listening today. As I've said before, Adaptive IG's mission is very simple. We're dedicated to helping organizations, their leaders and their staff, their people, create high-performing, inclusive and diverse cultures that deliver really tangible results. Today you heard how to ensure that diverse teams are a smooth road to success rather than a car crash of conflicting cultures. Adaptive IG believes that people working in inclusive cultures are the ones who deliver high performance. And I'd be delighted to meet or speak with any of the participants present today to explore how this might work in your organization or the organizations you work with. So as you can see on screen, hopefully, you can contact me at adaptivig@adaptiveintelligence.co.uk. You can find out more about Adaptive IG and what we do and how we do it at our website, www.adaptiveintelligence.co.uk. And in a follow-up email, we'll send you a link to the recording of this webinar, and we'll add some summary notes as well. Finally, we hope to see you at our next webinar in the Adaptive IG Foresight series on September the 25th, again at 1600 British Summer Time. This will be given by another founder member of Adaptive IG, Shahbad Toth. He will tell us all about, and he's kind of prefaced it already, culturally intelligent leadership, the competitive advantage. And we'll send you an invitation and a link via Eventbrite. I really hope we can see you then. Thanks to everyone and goodbye.